Quantum of Solace. Easily one of the worst James Bond movies out there, and unfortunately, a lot of that actually has to do with elements that were out of the filmmaker's control behind the scenes. I don't know, in general, I think this movie is incredibly boring and pointless. It mostly just serves as a companion piece to Casino Royale, albeit a mostly optional companion piece at that. For your eyes only. This is one of the most lackluster James Bond films I have ever seen. Not once do I ever feel any kind of sense of urgency into Bond's mission. Octopussy. Every now and again, I have the feeling that James Bond has been running out of ideas. This was one of those times. As there was nothing in this film that felt distinct or different, but instead it felt like it was copying a number of elements that we've already seen in the universe already. We've already had a ton of James Bond movies wind up with nuclear missiles, bombs, similar. We've already had MacGuffins. This time it's a shiny egg. We've already had jewelry smuggling. We've had gold and Goldfinger. We've had diamonds and diamonds are forever. And this time it's just jewelry in general, which is boring. The villain's plan at the end of the day still didn't even make a lot of sense because they failed to really explain what they're doing or why. A View to a Kill. Now, in the world of James Bond, this is a lot of people's least favorite installment, and there are things in the movie where I'd actually agree with that sentiment. But I would rather call this film mediocre and monotonous than worst Bond ever. No, there's nothing very interesting about a computer chip. Almost everything regarding that stupid computer chip I didn't care about. But the film still had good Bond moments. It had a decent amount of spy gear, which honestly seemed really lacking with most of Roger Moore's films. It had a few good action moments in the film as well, like the claustrophobic elevator sequence in the middle of blazing fire, like the stuff going on underground in a cave, like when James Bond is hanging off of a fire truck ladder while it's still in motion, like the fight on top of the Golden Gate Bridge. There's stuff to love. Oh, there's most definitely stuff to love. And thank God Roger Moore isn't wearing stupid things like a gorilla costume or clown costume in this film like he did with Octopussy. No, this movie's not terrible. Octopussy was terrible. For Your Eyes Only is terrible. This, as I mentioned before, was at most mediocre and monotonous. It was business as usual. Live and Let Die, the 8th film in the franchise. The movie suddenly introduced us to the world of the supernatural and magic, and it stopped making a lot of sense, ultimately losing its grip on reality. I don't know if they were attempting a Temple of Doom scenario or what, but James Bond isn't Indiana Jones. The supernatural is a pretty awesome plot device for some movies, and James Bond isn't one. There's also a moment where a bad guy gets inflated, starts flying away like a balloon. The part where James Bond jumps on alligators is pretty awesome from a practical effects kind of way. That was actually real-life alligators that were legitimately used as stepping stones. That's super dangerous, and I'm pretty sure PETA would have a fit, but movies wouldn't do that this day and age because it's illegal, and because CGI. And that's one thing that I can say about Roger Moore, that his Bond films probably had the best moments for practical effects, but that doesn't ultimately save the film from destruction. All it does is give you a memorable scene, which, given the series has been low on for a while, however, one memorable scene doesn't patch the entire film up. Thunderball, which is the 4th film in this massive spy franchise, still starring Sean Connery in the lead. When it comes down to Thunderball specifically, a plot regarding atomic bombs is hardly anything memorable, especially in this day and age where we've had countless TV shows and episodes that have threatened the same exact thing in a more realistic way, like in 24 or heck, other James Bond movies. Some imagery here and there are memorable, like the fact that it had the first real silhouette theme in the beginning. Goldfinger was still doing what Dr. No did, which was use a film projector against a woman's skin, which makes for an interesting artistic design. But it was Thunderball where we finally had silhouettes of women swimming, guns firing underwater, etc. against a colorful backdrop. This, of course, would go on to become kind of a staple in Bond films from this point forward, so it's nice to see that. The Man with the Golden Gun. And in this film, James Bond infiltrates a secret base with Q's latest invention, which is a third nipple. Not even kidding. The only spy gadget in this movie is the third nipple that Bond has to wear. You don't click it to create a bomb. It's not a tracking beacon. It's not a tiny little camera. It's just it's a prosthetic nipple.
What'll they think of next?
There's this really neat moment in the film where James Bond lights his car up with a broken bridge and ramps it, which doesn't just have the car jump from one spot to the next. No, it spins like a corkscrew and lands safely on the other side, all of which was real. All of it. The broken bridge was diligently created to look like a busted up, decrepit old bridge, but a lot of math was also put into place to make sure the car would do exactly what they wanted it to do. Fast and Furious focuses a lot on computer-generated effects, mechanical effects, but they didn't have that kind of stuff back then. They had to do it for real here. So they made it happen with practical effects, and I can't not praise them for it. Doctor, no, it didn't feel like a spy movie. It was like a mystery and Bond was this detective. There were no gadgets, which was actually a huge surprise to me when I first saw this movie. My second viewing was still met with some confusion story-wise, but not nearly as much as I had the first time around. This time I was particularly looking at Sean Connery's presentation of how he portrayed James Bond, and that's actually something I highly enjoyed, more so than I think I ever did before. He may possibly be the most calm, collected, coolly attitude Bond in existence. He expects the unexpected, unlike any Bond ever. He never shows a hint of shock or surprise. He just expects something bad is going to happen, and when it does, he's sitting there with his legs crossed, ready to deal with it. I mean, during the most tense scenes, he might as well be sitting there yawning because it's basically elementary to him. The world is not enough. This film is actually really convoluted and messy. It's got a lot going on that I like watching in the moment, but the story itself is just so messy that it dilutes some of the best things to be found in this movie, like the characters and spy gear. When you ignore the story and you take a look at the characters all on their own, they're all actually relatively strong, unique characters. Apart from Bond himself, you got two leading ladies, Electra King and Christmas Jones, and both of these characters are interesting and have their own character development where they start out as one way and they end another way. The villain of the film, Renard, who is known for his distinguishing feature, a bullet embedded in his skull that is slowly killing him and giving him the ability to never feel pain, which allows him to do much more than the typical person. Honestly, that makes him a great character, and great Bond villain. The X-ray glasses, that was pretty cool, and the fancy spy car. But honestly, everybody had really awesome stuff. The bad guys even had a couple of helicopters with these huge saws hanging off of them, which were really cool. Don't ask me how that even works, but I had just enough suspension of disbelief to enjoy watching it anyway. Diamonds Are Forever. This is one of the very, very few Bond films that stand out in its theme song, sung once again by Shirley Bassey, who sung Goldfinger. And both of those songs are absolutely some of the best theme songs this franchise has ever known, period. And like Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever also had the same director, Guy Hamilton, as it was clear they wanted to possibly rediscover some of the success that they found in Goldfinger. But obviously, that was mostly an attempt that fizzled out. Also, the film, for the most part, feels kind of original in its plot. Just like Goldfinger, again, it seemed to, for the most part, center around a plot separate from the tried and true Spectre adversarial thing. Heck, Diamonds Are Forever was almost a complete spiritual sequel to Goldfinger. Gold, diamonds. But for whatever reason, it didn't work out that way. You Only Live Twice, and as a whole, You Only Live Twice isn't a bad James Bond film. It feels like a good, complex spy mission, plus it acts as a mystery at the same time because there's a denouement where the villain explains his evil plan towards the end, weaving together all the prior questions up to that point. The main thing that I was a huge fan of in this movie was the pacing when it came down to Q. Most James Bond films features the Q character preparing James Bond for his mission early on in the film. He has all the gadgets, right? Well, he shows up seriously late in this movie because he's giving Bond a spy helicopter, which I guess he can't give Bond at the beginning of the movie. I mean, where's he gonna put it, right? But it just seemed really convenient and not planned out very well. Tomorrow Never Dies. But even though it's ridiculous, I would say that I probably had a better time watching this movie over Goldeneye as a general rule. That won't reflect in my end score, since Tomorrow Never Dies is mostly forgettable and empty in its plot, while Goldeneye wasn't. But if we were just looking at how fun each movie is, this one probably takes the cake. I also appreciated the mega use of Bond gadgets in the film after the previous movie kind of lacked in that department. They clearly listened to the fans and offered them more cool gadgets, which again made the film a more fun experience. Pierce Brosnan did pretty decently in his role again, and I don't know how important this is or not, but I think his James Bond looks the best when he's shooting a gun. It's a weird observation, I'll admit that, but that's just what I noticed. But when I'm forced to compare this to other Bond films, it's hard not to notice that Goldeneye was a better film for Pierce Brosnan. It was more memorable, and it's even considered to be one of the better Bond films all around, as it's been made into more than one video game. That's because the villainous plot in Goldeneye felt more original. The Spy Who Loved Me. Wow. You know, this film impresses me. It really does. Of course, I've seen it before, but back then I was not fully able to comprehend the moments in this film that would be considered memorable because it was my first experience with the franchise. Seeing this film for the second time, I was really shocked to find just how many moments in this film are actually memorable, and I think that mostly has to do with the filming location of Egypt. I mean, they really honed in on that, and it shows. There's a couple of moments in this film that are seared into my brain. One of those moments takes place at the pyramids where Bond is tailing a subject. And the way the scene is shot is actually really thrilling, and the use of lighting and the sound also really works out for the better, too. There's this big social event happening at the pyramids at the same time, and they're using the voiceover narration of that event to provide an extra layer of distinction during the sequence. I gotta be honest, that's one of the best Bond sequences ever. Moonraker. You know what? I do like this movie, even though it's nowhere near as iconic as I think The Spy Who Loved Me is. Truthfully, thinking back, the only thing that I really remembered about Moonraker was the final 30 minutes, aka the stuff in space. I mean, sure, that's easy enough to remember as it changes up the formula a little bit, but there's a bit more to it than that. Moonraker is one of the first Bond films to really have a massive character arc, especially for a villain. For Moonraker, it's Jaws who has his own personal journey that he has to go through from beginning to end. I mean, I honestly liked what they did with his character here. Now, sure, it was a bit goofier than his role in Spy Who Loved Me, but it was still a transformable role, and again, one of the first characters in the series as a whole to really transform this much. And personally, I think that's huge. Also, Drax is a bit more of a memorable villain than Stromberg in Spy Who Loved Me. I mean, sure, he looks like a really tall Peter Dinklage, but his motivations are slightly more logical than those of Stromberg's in the last film. The more I think about these movies back to back, the more I understand that I love The Spy Who Loved Me for the iconic Bond sequences and hate it for its kind of lack of story. And it's kind of the opposite for Moonraker, where I much prefer this villain and this story and the quest for clues that ultimately leads Bond to outer space, but it's lacking in iconic Bond moments. I mean, sure, the stuff in space is kind of iconic, but it's also extremely aged too. Russia with Love, I could definitely tell that this film specifically inspired the likes of Dr. Evil and his henchmen from the Austin Powers movies, as well as the bad guy in Inspector Gadget, always yelling,
"I'll get you next time, Gadget."
Because you never see his face, you just hear his deep, menacing voice while he's petting a kitty cat. He might as well be saying, "I'll get you next time, Bond." Goldeneye. This is the first one to really feel like the entire thing is just this massive, explosive film. Depending on who you are and what you prefer out of James Bond, that can both be a good thing and a bad thing. I am undecided. I don't mind the extra explosions or crisper image quality, but I was extremely disappointed in the utilization of more CGI and green screen work. One thing I actually really liked about this movie was the Goldeneye weapon itself. Yes, it's still a bit of a weird take on an EMP that doesn't make a lot of logical sense, but it is James Bond, and it doesn't need to make a ton of logical sense. I just kind of prefer that the villains and the weapons are original, and Goldeneye, for the most part, is original. So is the spy gear that they use. Goldfinger. You have Sean Connery in the lead, which a lot of Bond completists love as the secret agent. You have a couple of great, memorable villains when it comes down to Goldfinger himself, as well as the dangerous Oddjob and his killer frisbee hat. There's the evil self-motivated plan hatched up by Goldfinger. You got Pussy Galore, who is integral to the plot, and is also an interesting Bond girl because she's part of the villains team. You have the very first appearance of the Aston Martin car and all of its gizmos attached. You'll also have the image seared into your brain when you think about the title of this movie, and that is the dead girl in the beginning, painted gold as a warning sign to James Bond. Not only that, but James Bond also gets to implement some of his smarts that we saw him use in Dr. No, in addition to the spy gadgets that he has. Finally, it has the first truly great Bond title sequence and song. Now, I've heard all of the songs to all the different Bond films, and only 3 or 4 stand out to me. That's it. Goldfinger was the first. License to Kill. We finally have a glimpse of humanity, of grief, and in general, Bond's somewhat vulnerable here. And when you think about James Bond vulnerable, most people will probably think about Skyfall, and I would say he's much more vulnerable in that, and Skyfall's much more well-made all around, so people will most definitely think about it. But License to Kill shouldn't be ignored, because up to this point in the era of classic James Bond, this was probably the movie with the best and most grounded story. They changed the formula, which had to be avant-garde for them, but it worked out in the end. Die Another Day. Just sometimes I run into one of these more hated installments of the series and absolutely have a great time with it. It happened with Moonraker, and it's happening again now. Die Another Day is one of the series' most hated films. Even Pierce Brosnan himself has said that this is his least favorite. The writers have come out and apologized for it, stating that they didn't fully understand what the fans of the series wanted. And yet, here I am, thoroughly enjoying the flick. I'm not saying that it's for the right reasons or that it's a great cinematic masterpiece or anything. I'm just saying that I fully expected to pop this movie in at night, pause it halfway through, finish it the next day. But I couldn't stop it. I had to keep watching. I was that engaged with a ludicrous story. I realized that me praising the movie might force me to abscond, but I'll take that chance. The Living Daylights. What Timothy Dalton gives us feels perfect for James Bond. He's a little bit darker, he's a little bit edgier, and much more serious, which reminds me of Daniel Craig. But he also has elements of all the Bonds before him too. He's got the sharp intellect that Sean Connery was known for when he was the only agent that noticed the sniper in this movie was amateur. He had a little bit of Roger Moore in the things that he says because the pun jokes aren't completely gone. It's just that the movie doesn't completely revolve around them anymore. And heck, he's even got a little bit of George Lazenby in there as well, as he is a non-womanizing romantic guy. He builds the chemistry with this woman. He also respects the fact that she's spoken for, even though she's technically with a bad guy. I honestly love everything that Timothy Dalton has to offer and wish to God that he had more movies, because I can't just sit here and tell you that he's my favorite James Bond. I can't, because he was never given enough screen time to really showcase what he had to offer. He had 2 movies. 2, that's it. And this first one, The Living Daylights, he's the best thing about it. On Her Majesty's Secret Service. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a film that is memorable for standing out among other Bond films for honestly a variety of reasons. People will remember this movie for the odd structure that you don't normally see because Bond isn't on any official mission. You'll remember it for feeling a bit more human than any of the other films, as this is the film where James Bond gets married, and it's an event that they sometimes reference in later films. You'll remember it for the ski lodge filming location. If anything, the thing that you'll remember Lazenby for specifically is the hand-to-hand combat. That's how he's introduced, and it's something that he does here and there throughout the film, fight, hand-to-hand, and the footage is sped up to try to fool you into thinking that the man has really quick moves. It's not bad action by any means, I just would have liked to see it at a more regular pace. Spectre. That one scene in Spectre where James Bond infiltrates a Spectre meeting and Blofeld makes it known that he's aware of Bond's presence and then slowly looks exactly at Bond and how that shakes Bond to his core. I love that scene. It's so tense and it's nuts because James Bond was fighting earlier in a crashing helicopter, and he was doing that with perfect composure. But a single look from Blofeld shakes him. That's great, and it helps solidify the idea that this villain, Blofeld, is not a joke and should not be taken lightly. And Christoph Waltz, unsurprisingly, acts the heck out of it. It's amazing how different this role has been performed throughout all the different actors that have played Blofeld. It's Casino Royale. Allows the viewer to take a deep breath after watching so many cartoony, corny versions of James Bond, and we're able to see a much more vulnerable version of him. He's been vulnerable in the past, of course, and even more serious with Timothy Dalton, but nobody really encapsulated most of the best aspects of James Bond until Daniel Craig came along. I'm sorry to all you Sean Connery loyalists, but he was a sexist James Bond that was quite often harassing women, and was limited by the cheese of the 60s, which wasn't entirely his fault, but we're talking about spies here. Even if you loved the classic James Bond films, which I admire quite a bit on their own, you can't ignore that there was some issues here and there. Issues that I'm sure a lot of people thought were a part of the soul of James Bond and couldn't be fixed. But they were, and it still feels like Bond even though he's blonde with blue eyes. It still feels like Bond even though there isn't really any spy gear in the film. It still feels like Bond even though he isn't forcing himself on women, but respecting them. It still feels like Bond even though a mass majority of the film is just a card game. There's still high-octane action sequences, but it's just so well balanced that a long card game never really seems boring or tedious. In fact, thanks to the score and editing and select camera angles, the card game itself seems thrilling. No Time to Die. This film is fantastic. Stakes have never been higher for a James Bond film than they are in No Time to Die. A biological weapon linked to DNA? That's really hard to explain, and I won't even try. Just know that it's a very original concept and quite the threat for not only James Bond, but for anybody around the world. It's such a big thing that I have to say it's kind of on par with Thanos' own plan, though I will say that Thanos made a little bit more sense as to his reasonings. This film, it was more of a broad scope of an idea. You know, it's about what could be, and it's insane. This film is just jam-packed with fantastic action and a really good pacing for a film that's nearly 3 hours long. It's Skyfall. Daniel Craig's Bond has never shied away from approaching this character in new and different ways, and Skyfall is no different. While yes, the basics of a classic James Bond film are still there, this is the most vulnerable and human I've ever seen from Bond. Right from the get-go, before anything even happens. They make sure to tell the audience that this dude is human. He gets shot in the shoulder, and I don't even know if this is true or not, but it feels like it's the first time a bullet has ever actually hit him, other than maybe just graze him in the past. And for the first time, you're seeing, blood seep into his shirt. You're thinking, this guy really isn't invulnerable, he can get hurt. And that's just the beginning. He immediately gets gunned down by that sniper, making him fall several dozen feet to what feels like his death. I mean, no, it can't be his death, but gosh darn it, it feels like that. Past that, you've got immaculate cinematography, editing, and that freaking Skyfall theme song, which I still to this day consider to be the best song we've ever seen from the series. I don't know, I reserve this word for most films, but Skyfall feels flawless. The kind of flawless that almost seems like it has to be a mistake because it's so rare to get so much